Welcome, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director of Friends of the Everglades. This is our Clean Water Conversation for the month of June. Thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate it. Today, we have entitled this conversation rather provocatively, "Is this Florida's Flint?" And we're not trying to be alarmist here, but there's some really urgent information that we need to report about related to toxic algae blooms and cyanotoxins contaminating West Palm Beach's water supply and surrounding areas, and also presenting new public health concerns. So this is something, unfortunately, we've become accustomed to in Florida. We experienced toxic algae crises in 2016 and 2018 on both coasts of Florida. And today we have some new elements to talk about. So I'm very excited to introduce our guests today. First, I'd like to introduce Reinaldo Diaz. Reinaldo has served as the first and only Lake Worth Waterkeeper since 2017. Lake Worth Waterkeeper is a member of the Waterkeeper Alliance, and its mission is to protect and restore the historic Lake Worth Lagoon and its surrounding waters from Lake Okeechobee all the way to offshore in the Atlantic. And I think, Reinaldo, you are the only guest we've had on our Clean Water Conversations who has a repeat appearance. This is your second time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. What an honor.
Our next guest is Becky Harris. Becky got involved in clean water advocacy in 2018 when her dog Pandora became very ill after ingesting a bite of dead catfish containing microcystin, which came from the St. Lucie River. She's a full-time resident of Stuart, Florida, and serves as a board member of bullsugar.org. Welcome, Becky.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Barry Rosen. Barry is a nationally renowned algae scientist and professor in the Department of Ecology and Environmental Studies at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers. His studies are focused on harmful algal blooms with the goal of keeping communities healthy. And Barry, welcome today. We're excited to hear you enlighten us on this important topic. So I'm going to just kind of set the table for this discussion. We have three great experts here today, and they are experts in different realms of this problem. So if you're listening and you have questions during the live stream, please put them in the chat. We're going to get to as many as possible at the end. But first, I just want to kind of lay out what we've seen in recent weeks in Florida. So first, the most alarming development was that in May, residents who get water from West Palm Beach, more than 120,000 residents, were put under a health alert from May 28th to June 4th specifically, which started several weeks after the city first learned of a toxin called cylindrospermopsin in its drinking water. This is a toxin that comes from blue-green algae, a cyanotoxin. And a test May 17th showed harmful levels of the toxin for vulnerable populations. So young children, the elderly, nursing mothers, pregnant women, people with liver or kidney problems. And unfortunately, the public health advisory on this didn't go out until late at night on May 28th, right before a holiday weekend. So this caused a lot of alarm. People are still very concerned about the possible lingering effects. And this is something relatively new in Florida. Unlike in places like Flint, Michigan, for example, we generally have not had to worry about toxins in our drinking water on a widespread basis, even though we've had other toxic algae concerns for public health. So we're going to discuss that a bit. But I want to mention two other things that are going on in terms of toxic algae in Florida at the same time. So dating back to this spring, there was a very concerning cyanobacteria bloom at the Pahokee Marina in Lake Okeechobee, many times exceeding the recreational limit for exposure set by the WHO, World Health Organization. So we saw this start earlier than we often do in Florida. Typically, the quote-unquote algae season happens during the peak of summer when it's hottest. But this started earlier this year, so we knew we could be facing some risks. And at that time, the lake was pretty high and posed a real risk of discharges east and west. The lake has receded since then, but we're still seeing public health warnings in our canals and waterways. And that's definitely a concern we're going to talk about as well. And then last but not least, a dog did die in Palm Beach County in recent weeks after ingesting a lily pad along the C-51 canal that contained high levels of microcystin, another cyanotoxin. So we've got three things going on, right? Drinking water, We've got public health warnings related to recreational exposure in Lake Okeechobee and connected waterways. And then we have another dog death, unfortunately. So we're going to dive into this. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Rosen. Let's talk about the West Palm Beach water contamination. The toxin detected in the water supply there was different from microcystin, which is what we normally talk about in Florida. This was cylindrospermopsin. Can you help us understand this particular toxin and the threat it poses to public health?
Sure. Can I have the first slide?
Absolutely.
So first, I want to point out the organism that may be producing that cylindrospermopsin. So it used to be called cylindrospermopsis, and that's how we have that name. And it looks like the picture on the top or the one down below. Its new name, just so you know, if you try to find it, it's now called Raphidiopsis. What's different about this organism, it does not come up to the surface and cause those surface blooms and surface mats. It's in the middle of the water. And it's very common in Australia that this organism produces the toxin cylindrospermopsin. And there's a couple of forms of cylindrospermopsin. But in the United States, we only have a few cases, and I think this is one of them. In the drinking water for West Palm Beach, I also found high levels of cylindrospermopsin up in North Carolina, and there was also an abundance of this organism. So it makes sense, but on the other hand, I have isolates from Lake Okeechobee that do not make the toxin. They don't have the genes for it. So this is a different type of toxin. This is an alkaloid toxin, but it has more or less the same effects that microcystin does. It's resistant. The compound, the toxin, is resistant to pH changes. It's resistant to temperature, so you can't boil it away. So it's more difficult to treat and deal with than microcystins. If I can go to the next slide.
Sure. And before you move on, I just want to ask, if it's suspended in the water column, does that necessarily mean it's not visible the way microcystin can be when we see those blue-green algae mats?
Yes, you will not see this. You see how lightly pigmented it is? It's at best a light brown, kind of down in the water. You won't even necessarily see it. And that water supply is relatively clear. It's got a lot of calcium in it. So it's not like having a nutrient-enriched thick mat like we see that happens with microcystis.
So it's an invisible danger, if you will.
It is, and the cells are somewhat leaky, especially compared to this organism. This is Microcystis aeruginosa. This is the one people think about. You can see that this is almost a millimeter across, and they get even bigger. And you can take a picture of it with your iPhone. You could not do that with Raphidiopsis cylindrospermopsis. This is an organism that can, and I use that word can, make microcystins. You got to have the genes. And by the way, microcystins is a family of about 250 compounds. Let's go one more slide because I want to show some other organisms that are also known cylindrospermopsin producers so that we aren't thinking that just taking care of the Raphidiopsis is it. Because there's an organism used to be called Anabina. It's now called the locospermum. It's a known producer of microcystins, saxitoxins, cylindrospermopsins, and anatoxins. All four of the major toxins to be concerned about.
So I'm sure people watching this, particularly if they get their water from West Palm Beach, are wondering who's protecting them from this invisible public health threat. So I'd like to ask you, Dr. Rosen, about the regulatory guidelines for cylindrospermopsin. Are they adequate? Who's in charge of them? And I know you have a slide here on it. I'll cue up.
Perfect. So these are guidelines. They're technically not regulatory. They're not regulations. EPA, after the big event that happened in Toledo on Lake Erie, put out guidelines. And of course, you can see the concentrations. It's 0.3 micrograms per liter for microcystin and 0.7 micrograms per liter of cylindrospermopsin. But they added some caveats. It's for children younger than school age, and it's really a 10-day exposure. So, and then if you look at non-school age children, it's a higher concentration. I don't know how you would regulate that at the tap. You'd have to go for the more conservative, safer numbers. And the values, we have another set of guidelines for recreation that came out after this in 2019, which are much higher levels because recreational exposure should be less. The problem is If you're a drinking water facility and you're filtering the water gently, you won't rupture the cells and you'll get most of the toxin out because it's inside the cells. But if you're too rigorous in your filtration, you will rupture the cells and it'll break through that drinking water plant. Free chlorine works well on microcystin and cylindrospermopsin, but other things don't. Ozone works well, but other treatment methods don't work so well. So it's tough. It's up to, at this point, it isn't required. It's up to the drinking water facilities to keep an eye on these two compounds.
Interesting. And you already mentioned the recreational guidelines, which are on this slide. So I'm not sure that would bring a great degree of comfort to people in West Palm Beach who have been exposed to this. And I want to talk to Reinaldo now about how this happened. So Lake Okeechobee, as we know, is frequently plagued by blue-green algae. It's also the backup water supply for West Palm Beach. I think about half of West Palm Beach's water supply comes from the lake. Can you help us understand the link between the lake and what happened in West Palm Beach in recent weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a map that kind of depicts it. It's really important to keep in mind that the Lake Worth Lagoon used to be a landlocked freshwater lake. It wasn't always the northern estuary that it is. It wasn't always a coastal estuary. So our connection is completely man-made to the lake. And that's what you're seeing here on a map. Starting at Lake Okeechobee, there's three conveyances to start with. There you have the L8 Canal, which is the northern edge of the Everglades agriculture area. And then you have the L10 Canal in the middle, and then the L14, L13 down by Belle Glade there. This map, the little green tags are reports that I have submitted and where we monitored cyanobacteria in those water bodies. And it kind of like just, you follow the Lake O water and you'll follow the cyanobacteria. At least that's what we've been seeing ever since I started Lake Worth Waterkeeper, ever since we've been intensively monitoring our watershed. That's the common denominator. And what happened last month and throughout the dry season, or what was happening, is essentially especially with the L10 and the L8 canals specifically, water is sent, Lake Okeechobee water is sent through those canals with the primary intention of irrigating the agriculture fields in the EAA. And so, because it's a dry season, they need to irrigate their crops. They wanted water. So they draw water from Lake Okeechobee down those canals. And something important to consider is how they irrigate their fields. They're not using like what we generally see, think about when you see farming on TV or the movies, you see those big sprinkler systems and stuff like that. It's very different here. The way that fields are irrigated here is water is drawn out of those canals by small pump stations into smaller canals that flood the field. So they'll flood the field, maybe in a foot of water or so, saturate the soil. And then once that soil is at the right saturation, they draw that field down, and that water with everything that was sprayed on that field gets brought right back into the canal. Then it continues down in its way, and then right where the C51 canal starts, normally that water should go into what we call stormwater treatment areas, which are those two triangle shaped, they look small on a map, but they're pretty immense in person. And they're basically artificial wetlands, and those normally clean the water to actually send it south. This last year, the STAs this year the STAs are being rehabbed, so they weren't able to send really that much water down south. So what ended up happening is the water, when it goes east down to C51 Canal, into Lake Clark, which is that tag number 6, and then into the Lake Worth Lagoon. Although it hasn't quite made it that far just yet, because the last spillway into the Lake Worth Lagoon has been closed because of dry season. We haven't had to really discharge too much through that structure. But the takeaway is the only reason why water went down to C51, I'll get to the M Canal in a second, is because since the EAA was drawing water for irrigation at those structures, like where that number 2 is, for example, there were days where the water flow we measure in cubic feet per second, it was well over 1,000, maybe like 1,200 or something like that. And then down by the C51, we get essentially the leftovers. There was only about 150, 200 CFS. And that little bit, that trickle of water was enough to send cyanobacteria, or more specifically the nutrients from the EIA and from the lake into the eastern half of the watershed. And that's what's been driving the cyanobacteria blooms everywhere. M canal is kind of a very similar animal. That canal diverts water away from the L8 canal and goes about northeast, and then makes a hard right turn going east into grassy waters. And that's where, generally people will say grassy waters is the surface water source for West Palm Beach, and South Palm Beach. But what we saw, since it was pretty dry, and it still is, I mean, there are parts of grassy waters, if you've ever been to the visitor center, it looks like you can walk across the entire thing because it's pretty low right now. We're not particularly concerned with oxidation or any problems with the soil there because it's part of the process. But what happens when grassy waters is low, you really can't see it on this map, but the M canal, it cuts across the grassy waters, and there's the canal continues. There's a little bit of a channel that goes across, and so when grassy waters is low, the water that's coming in through the M canal that would otherwise disperse throughout the wetland and be treated kind of like the STA would, instead it goes basically straight through down that channel and into Lake Mangonia, and then Clear Lake, which is that number 7 there. It's a really small lake, and Clear Lake is where the water treatment plant is located and draws its water from. So that's pretty much the connection. Water primarily right now gets sent through the EIA for irrigation, and then the leftovers just make its way naturally throughout the system.
And prior to the city detecting elevated cylindrous spermopsin levels, the connection between the lake and grassy waters was cut off because of microcystin levels being elevated. Do I have that right?
I wasn't sure if it was microcystin. So when I first made that report on the M canal, where that number 5 tag is, it's one of our sampling locations. I believe it was like May 1st, and essentially, anybody can do this. It's the Florida's Florida DEP has their algal, their algal bloom website that you can make reports on. And May 1st was when I first noticed that M canal, that the bloom was there. It looked like microcystin, so yeah.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know it was your report, Reinaldo, that led to that. And it's a great reminder to anyone listening that if you see water that looks like it has blue-green algae in it, please go to the DEP's algal bloom reporting site. You can Google it. We'll put it in the chat. It's easy to find because, yes, they have certain testing stations in the lake, for example. But if you're not reporting it, there's a good chance it won't be detected, and it's really important. So thanks for explaining those connections. Florida's network of plumbing can be complicated, confounding, but it's so important to understand, especially when we have toxins moving into our water supply. So thanks for that explanation. I have a follow-up for you, Reinaldo, and it's about the blue-green algae task force that Governor DeSantis created in early 2019. It was one of his first actions as governor, actually. He appointed some very bright, qualified scientific minds to sit on that task force, and they came out with a series of recommendations. So at the end of 2019, their recommendation document included a couple sentences. I'm going to read them now because I want to get your take on them. They called for a defensible health advisories for blue-green algae to be established by the Florida Department of Health, and defensible water quality criteria to be established by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. These actions should be supported by the best available science and monitoring, and updated as new information becomes available. So we just haven't seen much progress on these recommendations. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, Reinaldo, what effective regulation of cyanotoxins should look like in Florida?
Yeah, I mean, there's many regulations that are needed across the board. Everything from regulating how much nutrient pollution goes into the system, so things like fertilizers and whatnot. But when it comes to like water quality standards, I think Dr. Rosen really highlighted an important one, and that's the fact that we do have recommendations, right, of what these cyanotoxins should be at or lower. And that's the unfortunate thing, is they're just recommendations. There's really, there's a list of toxins called a regulated substance list. It's maintained. It's basically a list of all the famous things like lead and arsenic, all these things that are generally tested regularly for water quality, and that's because they're on that regulated substance list. And in Florida, no cyanotoxin is on that list. So, from a legal perspective, utilities and municipalities, they're not even really burdened to test for any cyanotoxins. They could theoretically just ignore it and never do any testing, and it's a major problem. So we need these regulations. We need cyanotoxins listed on this list, because that list will require utilities, especially utilities that are still drawing water from surface sources, to regularly test. I mean, there are places like in Ohio where they test daily for cyanotoxins. So we know, obviously information needs to get out much quicker in terms of warning people of exposure. We know what needs to be done. And unfortunately, like in many instances in Florida, the law has not caught up with the science. And that's kind of what we're seeing across the board.
One thing worth noting is that the Waterkeepers have been excellent about tracking the lack of signage over the last couple of years where algae blooms have presented. So great, important work there. I think we've seen a little bit of progress in terms of monitoring and signage, but we're not where we need to be. It's much more reactive than proactive.
Right. That's another piece of important regulation that's needed, is Florida doesn't have a statewide standard. So there's no, law that says wherever you're at in Florida, Department of Health, if X level of cyanotoxins is found, then this kind of sign needs to be put up. And what we see is kind of a piecemeal pick and choose of where signage gets posted and the type of sign. And what we're seeing here in Palm Beach County is, because of our work, likely we're seeing more signs, but the signs are really inadequate. I mean, they're usually just a sheet of paper stapled to a wood post. They get run over by lawnmowers. They're not durable, especially in Florida's heat and rain. So we get, from agencies like Department of Health and others, without that regulation forcing them to do the work, we get mediocrity.
Right. And I know you've seen people fishing in these blooms. It's not uncommon. So signage is really important. One other point I want to make is about surface water supplying drinking water supply. So that is the case in West Palm Beach and the other municipal areas that are served by West Palm Beach's water. It's not the case everywhere in Florida. So I don't want everyone to get the impression that their water could be fed by surface waters that contain these algae blooms. It's actually quite rare, but it's still the case in West Palm. Okay, I want to turn to Becky now. So Becky, you became an advocate for toxic algae after Pandora. Your dog was sickened in 2018, and you've become a support system for people like Pam McAfee. And if that name sounds familiar to our viewers, it's probably because you saw her on the news. She lost her dog Bella, unfortunately, after she was exposed to algae along the C-51 canal. Can you tell us, Becky, about Bella's story and how you came to get involved in it?
I can. So the McAfees live on the C-51 canal. They enjoy boating on it. And on May 24th, they took their boat out. They took Bella and the other two boxers that they own out. And after they brought the boat out of the water, they cleaned it, and some vegetation came off the boat, lily pads, etc. Unbeknownst to them, Bella ate some of the vegetation. Later that day, she starts throwing up. She becomes tired. They're not sure what's happening to her. I know exactly what they're experiencing. And of course, it was late for them, like myself. So they go to the emergency pet clinic in Palm Beach. Bella was treated there, and unfortunately, the treatment was not successful, and she ended up dying the next day. Bella died from microcystin poisoning. it is essentially what happens is your liver fails. And your liver is a very important organ. It produces clotting mechanisms. So what happened to her, as well as Finn from Stuart, Florida, is they essentially bleed out. And it's just a gruesome, awful death.
And Becky, can you mention the lab results that confirmed microcystin, in case people are wondering?
So what was really smart of the McAfees is they gathered some of Bella's vomit, and they sent it off to Greenwater Labs, which is who all of us sent our information off to when our dogs got sick. And at least I'm reading from the lab report was stated that the levels of microcystin detected in the vomit sample were substantially high enough to have caused intoxication. And then additionally, what the McAfees did is they sent Bella's body off to be necropsied. And the initial examination reports are that she hemorrhaged from her stomach and intestines. She had pulmonary edema in her lungs and necrosis of the liver. So we're waiting on some additional results that will show microcystin poisoning within the liver, et cetera. We're waiting on those lab reports. But I think of an important fact for everyone out there to know with their pets and with themselves when they're recreating is you don't always see the toxins in the water. I can only speak for myself, is that my dog took a bite of a dead catfish on the beach. That morning, my beach had no green water, no green algae on the beach. The next day, it was loaded. So what's important is to, as we get to talking maybe about the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, is warnings.
Mm-hmm. So let's go there. You attended Wednesday's Blue-Green Algae Task Force meeting, Becky, in West Palm Beach. I was there as well. And I'm curious to hear your assessment of the discussion and the actions taken since the task force was formed in 2019. You've really gotten involved in this movement, and it's a big credit to you because I know you do this all on your own time. So as a resident, how do you feel about what you've seen, and what's the number one thing you want to see that's not been done?
Well, thank you for your kind words, but I have to tell you, I'm still mad about what happened to my dog. So, and I'm grateful that Pam is now taking a lead and she's speaking out as well, which everybody can do. But I think that task force is a tremendous amount of experts and fantastic people. I think COVID has set them back. I think the DEP leadership change has set them back. I think they have good goals. I know yesterday they talked about, or 2 days ago, they talked about the innovative technology to remove the blooms and the toxins, but yet then they said, but the real important thing is to reduce the nutrients. And that's the key thing that has to be done. Instead of playing catch up after we have a disaster, let's stop the disaster before it happens. I think what this group really needs is some teeth, maybe from the governor, to get the legislature to make the changes. So I'm hopeful that happens, but my purpose to go to that meeting, and Pam went as well, was to point out that, which is what I did in 2018, I pointed out there were no warnings. In 2018, samples were taken, toxins were found to be high, days, if not weeks, before the Stuart dogs got sick. No warnings. Fast forward to Bella's situation, samples were taken as early as the beginning of May, and the next week, and toxins were found to be high, and no warnings were put out. So that has to be changed. And Reinaldo talking about, the signage is terrible. It's not consistent, and that needs to be addressed.
Right. And here's just a picture from behind Bella's owner's home when that happened, just to give you a visual. So back to the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, much of the meeting was focused on, quote unquote, innovative technologies to treat harmful algal blooms, blue-green algae in particular. So algicide is being used and other technologies. There was some discussion about unintended consequences. None of these technologies right now are being peer reviewed in terms of their effectiveness or unintended consequences. So there are a lot of questions. And one of the things that struck me from that meeting on Wednesday was something Jim Sullivan from Harbor Branch said. He's a member of the task force. And he reminded us all that nature abhors a vacuum. So if we're applying algicide or some technology, some treatment to kill a certain type of microcystin, it's possible that something else could rise in its place that could be even more harmful. So there are concerns.
Sorry.
No problem. We roll with the punches here. So I'd like to turn it back to you, Dr. Rosen. I know you've spent some time out at Pahokee Marina, which became an emblem of Florida's toxic algae crisis this spring. The mats out there were really reminiscent of what we saw in 2018 and 2016 along the coast. The Water Management District, South Florida Water Management District, treated the bloom with algicide. It's now reemerged. I just saw a news report in recent days. So what's your take on the methods being used to treat blooms in and around the lake, and what, if they're effective, are you worried about unintended consequences as well?
Well, first of all, as far as effective goes, if you, for example, treated that bright green patch right in front of you with an algicide, it's going to die. But you didn't remove the nutrients. And outside an area where that bloom is, which I call outside the kill zone, you've got organisms ready to move back in to fill that vacuum and start to grow all over again. They like that quiescent, quiet water. Pahokee Marina is a perfect example. It's on that southern tip of Lake Okeechobee. The water gets into those backwaters. It isn't flushed out of there. Plenty of nutrients. Temperatures warming up, it just proliferated and got quite thick. It would have slowed down and stopped growing if the nutrients had run out, but there was plenty of nutrients. So when you kill and don't remove, the nutrients, you've really done nothing except for a temporary fix. So it's an issue. Are they effective? Yeah, but you may also kill beneficial algae. You may wipe out microcystis, but you may allow Dilocospermum, which can make the neurotoxins, which are much more potent. It might start to grow. So there are unintended consequences as far as temporarily destroying a part of the natural system, albeit it's enriched by the nutrients we put in anthropogenically, but it's not a simple fix. If the nutrients are brought down, you'll still get a bloom, but it won't be as thick or as prolonged as what you see in this picture. And I'd like to add, if you have a bloom like this, please make sure you keep your pets out of the water and your children out of that water, because even if it don't know that it's confirmed that it has toxins, it has the potential. So, you have to be safe with this.
Absolutely. Thanks for explaining that. So, Reinaldo, let's talk about the Army Corps of Engineers' new Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which has consumed many hours of our time at Friends of the Everglades. Just to summarize for viewers, this is the Army Corps of Engineers' new lake plan that will determine when and where water is moving from the lake for the next decade to come, really. It has been accelerated due to the toxic algae blooms we saw in 2018. And it's funny, bureaucracies move slowly, and accelerated has meant that we're 2 years into this process and we still have a ways to go. So I'd like to ask you, Reinaldo, what your overall read is on this process and whether it will bring relief from harmful algal blooms. And I know you're particularly concerned about Lake Worth Lagoon and how it gets treated in this process.
We share the same lack of encouragement, if you will, as Friends of the Everglades. It's pretty disappointing. The metrics that we're seeing as well. It needs to be so much better, right? And what Dr. Rosen was talking about at Pahokee Marina, I was obviously there too. It's part of our watershed. When we get so much focus on the things that we don't need, it's almost like agencies and the state are literally willing to try everything but the one thing that we're asking for, right? And what I see on these metrics that are on the models for Losum is, Lake Okeechobee is just, it's like not getting the attention that it deserves, right? And we know what the fix is. The fix is to reduce nutrients. Well, what do we need to do that with? Well, we need to keep the lake lower. We need to bring back habitat. We need to bring back, subaquatic vegetation. That's what's going to remove the nutrients from the lake, and hopefully in the future, sooner than later, is going to combat these cyanobacteria blooms. There's of course other things that need to be factored in, like climate change and whatnot, but the bringing back habitat, proper Lake Okeechobee management, keeping it lower, cleaning that water, sending it truly south to the lower Everglades, we know that's what's going to work. And unfortunately, it almost seems like that is not what the focus is going to be, right? I mean, the whole, my experience at Pahokee Marina that inspired, we have our latest sticker, which is a little vacuum cleaner, if you remember the Dust Buster from the 80s. And it's like, that's the best we're going to get. That's what so-called innovative technology. It's like, no, we need to focus on proper lake management. And what we're seeing in the Losum process is concerning, because a lot of the models appear to be slight improvement over what's traditionally being done, but it's just not enough. I mean, like I pointed out, the only reason why Lake Worth Lagoon watershed, why we're dealing with cyanobacteria bloom during the dry season, is because of that discharging out of the lake, because the priority user right now is agriculture and irrigation. If that didn't happen, we probably would have been spared. But those are the things that need to look at. And one particular model, the BB, just seems to focus mostly on water use and doesn't focus on lake health. It doesn't focus on protecting downstream users. So we share the same thoughts. Very discouraging. Could be better.
Yeah, and we could spend a whole hour talking about Losum. I definitely wanted us to touch on it today because it's entering a critical point. July is going to be really important in terms of which plan the Army Corps of Engineers chooses. So if you do want to learn more about that, you can visit everglades.org. We post updates regularly. There's also an important meeting Tuesday. The South Florida Water Management District will be hosting a workshop on Losum and probably making a recommendation on which plan they want. So yes, the Army Corps of Engineers is a federal agency, but the state of Florida plays a really important role in moving water from the lake as well. And the state of Florida is responsible for water quality. So they're critical in all of this. I just want to pause here and say, if you have any questions for our group, we're going to be taking those in just a few minutes. Please post them in the chat, either on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So before we get to that, Becky, I'd like to turn it to you. And this is a great question to follow the Losum discussion, because this stuff can be intimidating for the public. If it's not your full-time job or passion, it can be really hard to follow and stay current on. What's your advice to everyday people who want to get involved? How can they be most effective in terms of advocacy to prevent toxic algae blooms?
Well, you're right. It is very complicated. But there are a number of people out there that can help you with that. And there are a number of ways that you can get involved. And there might be a group that fits your needs. For example, Captains for Clean Water, if you're a fishing guy. If you're up here in Stewart, maybe the River Coalition is a group you want to be a part of. Some of these groups, like the River Keepers, like Reinaldo, I mean, they have blogs. Reinaldo's blog is great. They have websites. Friends of the Everglades, I was not told to plug this, but your emails, just get on the email list. Your emails are so informative. You've got links that will expand upon the discussion, and you've got suggestions of how you can get involved. And I mean, and then getting involved, go to meetings, go to Zoom meetings. You can public comment, you can email comment. What I've learned is if you're gonna public comment, you better prep ahead of time because yes, it is intimidating and it's not what the public does for a living. But having said that, I do find that all these people who are up on the stage, high up, listening to the public, they truly are listening. I think they are. And I think we've got a good group of people, particularly at the district. I think the Army Corps is trying, and they do want to hear from us.
Thanks, Becky. There were some really compelling speakers from West Palm Beach at the Blue-Green Algae Task Force meeting on Wednesday who spoke about how it contaminated their water, how they felt after, and that kind of comment really does have impact. You could see, at least with the task force members, that it moved them. So the connection that needs to occur, right, is from these task force members being concerned to regulatory action. And unfortunately, in Florida, we've had some disconnect there, and that's a lot of what we work on. So I'd like to ask Allie, who is behind the scenes for us, to queue up any questions we may have for the group. I think we're getting quite a few in, and we'll get through as many as we can. So the first one we have here is from Victoria Olson. She asks, what is the cause that makes the blue-green algae? I think I'll throw that to Dr. Rosen.
Okay, so first of all, blue-green algae are natural in the water. So they're a normal part of the organisms we would find in the water. It's when we have excessive nutrients and the right light and the right temperature that certain ones begin to bloom. Bloom meaning they grow a lot faster than can be eaten by the other organisms in the water. So I think, first of all, you have to think about temperature. You have to think certainly about excess nutrients, the right light, the right time of year. All those things make blue-greens grow really well. In the winter, we have diatoms and we have other organisms. But in the spring and summer, we have cyanobacteria, blue-green algae.
So it's nutrient pollution. That's the root cause of these blooms. And that's why we talk so much about nutrient pollution regulation.
Right.
Thanks for explaining that. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
And it is not the pesticides. Someone commented about pesticides themselves. Although you might kill some of the beneficial algae with the pesticides, cyanobacteria, blue-green algae are just as susceptible to pesticides and would be killed by an herbicide. So,
and getting back to your original point, I think not all algae is bad. In fact, much algae is beneficial. It's critical to our ecosystem. So we don't want to kill all algae.
50% of the oxygen we breathe comes from algae, whether we like it or not.
Interesting. Okay. We can queue up the next question, Allie. This is from Diana Peronis. When algicide is used, wouldn't the dead decomposing matter in the water also become an unintended consequence, taking up oxygen? So I'll open that up to the group, although I suspect you'll have something to say, Dr. Rosen. You want to take it first?
Yeah, so absolutely. When you kill the organisms and their content leaks out, the bacteria chew them up. But guess what? When a bloom gets thick at nighttime, that whole biomass also consumes oxygen. Most fish kills that we see are from oxygen depletion. Rarely, at least in the freshwater side, is it because of toxin. We really don't see the toxicity causing the fish kills. Low dissolved oxygen every single time, probably 99% of the time, low dissolved oxygen. Killed cells, dying cells, nighttime utilization of oxygen.
So how does that inform the algicide application and its benefits versus harm?
You mean the blinders that people use with the algicide application?
Yes, talk about that.
Well, they have a job, and that's to treat that bloom and try to suppress it. So the best way to do that is to catch it early in the season. And, if you had some kind of early detection so you could do a rapid response. But again, we don't know what organisms we're going to push the whole community into. It could be a worse organism. You might kill a microcystis that isn't a toxin producer and make one that is. So there's no simple solution as far as plain old killing it.
Reinaldo, what's your read on the algicide that's being applied?
Again, the only solution or the thing that we need to be focusing on is removing those nutrients from the water that caused the bloom. Because just like Dr. Rosen said, when you're using something like an algicide, if your primary mission is to kill one of the cyanobacteria, then you're likely going to have unintended consequences, right? It's almost like we always hear stories of things like wildlife management where You know, famously like cane toads or something, where people are like, let's do something that is not quite natural to the system, and that's going to resolve this issue. And generally, the consequences are pretty drastically bad, right? And I kind of equate that with algicide. There's really no natural process or system where you're going to see something like a heavy metal or something used to, you know, in nature to kill that much cyanobacteria at one time. So everything we need to be doing needs to bring us back closer to that natural process, right? That's why for Everglades restoration, our big focus is to bring the entire system back closer to what it once was before, you know, we came down and we made it a very unnatural system. And so something like an algicide, it's just not what we would see, you know, in the natural world. And it's not really a focus that we need to be putting any effort into.
I struggle with this because you could see how at the Pahokee Marina, where people were living on their boats, and not all extremely wealthy people, I don't think, you don't want anyone exposed to cyanotoxins right there. So there's an acute need to protect people, but there's also the out of sight, out of mind factor that comes into play. So this summer, this spring, the Florida Water Management District is literally chasing algae, right? And dousing it with treatment and making it invisible. But that doesn't mean the problem's gone away. And as awful as this blue-green algae is in our waterways, it does create urgency on the part of policymakers, elected officials to address it. I just get concerned that if we're only addressing it by making it superficially disappear, that we won't get to the nutrient reductions that we know we need.
Oh, absolutely. And Pahokee Marina was such a perfect example, because when, you know, I first reported that and we first were dealing with that situation, there was all kinds of excuses coming from the other side, let's say, right? Saying, oh, it's the boats in the marina that are causing it. It's, you know, septic and sewer, which in that area is just an absurd excuse. But, you know, we hear these excuses, and realistically, you know, you hear like I mentioned before, they'll do anything but the one thing we ask for, which is nutrient reduction, bringing back habitat. And we hear almost related to these excuses is the so-called innovative technologies or the lackluster efforts that we get. And it's like, okay, we're going to vacuum the cyanobacteria out of the Pahokee Marina. And it's like, that's great for that like square mile of water. But what about the other hundreds, you know, in Lake Okeechobee that's covered by this stuff? It's like you can't separate the water, especially in a marina. And it's very unfortunate because, you know, I spend a lot of time there. I talk to the people who live in those boats. They know they're getting hurt. I talk to the people in those communities. I know what their thoughts are. They know they're getting hurt. They know what's happening. But similar to what Becky mentioned earlier, in terms of like the need to educate people, one of the big problems is those people know they're getting hurt, except they have been so misinformed over the years that they don't see any other alternative.
Gotcha. And thanks for all you do to be out in the field documenting what's happening. I think you were the first to show the Pahokee bloom, and that really spurs action. Seeing is believing. Okay, we'll take our next question. It sounds like we have quite a few questions. This is from Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch, who's a member of the governing board, South Florida Water Management District. She says, assessment of cyanotoxins in Florida's lakes, reservoirs, and rivers, 2001, Florida Harmful Algal Bloom Task Force. I think this is the source. It must be noted, social media was not around during these earlier publications. We have it now, so we should showcase old and new research on cyanobacteria. And the legislature must address these issues. How can we focus more on our state lawmakers who really hold the key? And just before I toss that to you all, that 2001 publication did address cylindrospermopsin in the lake, if I'm not mistaken. So there's been information about this stuff out there for a long time. So Becky, I think we'll start with you. How can we focus more on state lawmakers who really hold the key? As a resident and an advocate, what do you think?
Well, I've gone in and actually talked to my legislators. You can make appointments. You can talk to them and go in there ready and educated and demand that they make some changes.
Yes, I think reaching out is a really viable option. Friends of the Everglades created a post-session legislative report this year to track legislation that was good or not good for water and the Everglades ecosystem as a whole. So tracking and staying current on what's done or not done, I think, is really important. And we should mention there were a pair of bills this past session in Tallahassee that called for enacting all of the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, which would have been a daunting task, but certainly could have been worked toward. And that those bills didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. So there are proposals out there. It's just a matter of the public letting elected officials know that they want action. Anything to add on that, Reinaldo or Dr. Rosen?
Yeah, I do for sure. I mean, public participation is so important, especially on environmental matters in Florida, because often on environmental policy, they're not particularly popular, right? They're not what is driving Tallahassee for sure. And our legislator, that's such a great call out by Jackie, because it really is our legislators that are dropping the ball on this. I mean, shocker, a bunch of politicians don't have the public's best interest in mind. Like, that's not too surprising, but if enough of the community stands up and reminds them that the only reason why they're in these offices is because they're elected, we can move the needle on that stuff. And it's important to stay informed, not just on environmental issues, but when it comes to these sort of things, other things are just as important, right? Like another big one, whenever me or any other environmental activist needs to take a legal action to protect whatever environmental issue we're dealing with, the first thing that the other side will generally do is attack our standing, and which is basically our right to bring a case to court. And there are fixes out there that's relatively newish legal concepts, such as rights of nature, where it's like, well, if you're going to attack our standing, then let's just give those rights to the water body itself, and that would be almost impermeable. It'd be difficult to take that away in court. So there's other fixes that relate. LOSOM is such a important piece of policy that we're focusing on right now, but that focus is because it's coming due very soon, so we need to focus on it. But it's really just one of a long list of policy and law that needs to change. And just like Jackie called them out on, basically saying it's our legislature that is not catching up to the science. It's our law that is not catching up, and there's many things that need to be done to fix that.
Right. And unfortunately, in some cases, they've been moving backwards in the legislature. Mm-hmm. So great point. We'll take the next question, Allie. Okay, this one's from Michael Adler. Is there danger of cyanotoxins in the small canals that are throughout the developed areas, or is this primarily just a problem from Lake Okeechobee and downstream? Great question. I'll start with you, Dr. Rosen.
Absolutely. Small canals can easily have plenty of organisms in it. It really does depend on you being exposed to it. Most of these toxins that we worry about are through ingestion, drinking water. But think about your pets. They're not going to be thinking of a canal as it's their drinking water source, versus us getting it from the tap. So it's the pets that are greatly exposed in small canals. Blue-greens grow everywhere. Cyanobacteria grow everywhere. So it's not a surprise to find it in small canals.
Anything to add, Reinaldo? I know you spend a lot of your time in the canals.
Yeah, I mean, drinking it is definitely a concern, but I mean, I'm also very concerned with the ingestion of sustenance fishermen feeding themselves these fish. I mean, in Canal Point, Pahokee, it doesn't matter how bad the bloom is. I always see people fishing and filling up their coolers, and that can equate throughout the watershed, really. But for Lake Worth Lagoon, at least for Palm Beach County, what I've been seeing over the last few years is, yes, there are certain lakes, like if you're in our area, Lake Osborne, for example, has had small cyanobacteria blooms driven, like when we're not taking Lake Okeechobee discharges. But generally, when we see those smaller blooms in smaller canals, it never rises to the level of what you see in Pahokee Marina or even Lake Clark this summer. Generally, it's a smaller bloom. It's dissipated. It lasts maybe like a week at the most. I remember there was a kind of a rare bloom maybe 2 years ago, it was like in October, where almost ironically, it was right behind South Florida Water Management District headquarters, right on the C51. And that bloom was maybe like a mile long, and it lasted, I think, 3 days before it finally dissipated. When for these long-term, weeks, months on end cyanobacteria blooms, at least for our watershed, what we're seeing is the common denominator is Lake O and that main confluence of water that we see. And keep in mind, like, ingesting it also can mean breathing it in. And we know because of recent research is that cyanotoxins can travel for miles and miles being carried by the wind. So affected water body, you might live 10 miles away from the C51, but if it has enough cyanobacteria in it, you could still be exposed if you're downwind.
Right. During the 2018 outbreak in Stewart, folks who worked at Florida Sportsman, their noses were swabbed. They worked right along the St. Lucie River, and virtually all of the people who participated in that test tested positive. So we know these toxins can be aerosolized, but we don't know enough about how far they can be carried and how dangerous it is when you breathe them in.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll get to our next question. I think we have a couple more we'll tackle. Diana Peronis asks, can we clarify what the excessive nutrients are? What
Yes.
are the major sources? So I'll start with you, Reinaldo.
Okay, so nutrients are, think of things that will drive plant growth. And the big ones we're concerned about are phosphorus and nitrogen. They're very popular as fertilizers. And depending on where you're at in the state, the primary contributor might change a little bit. So if we're here in the Lake Worth Lagoon, our biggest contributor is going to be the Everglades agriculture area, right? And it makes sense. You're looking at 500,000 acres of farmland of industrial monoculture, which is a type of farming that generally is going to need a lot of what we call soil amendments. So soil amendments will include nutrient pollution, right? Phosphorus, nitrogen, but it also includes things like sulfates. It includes things like pesticides, herbicides, all these things that are needed in the growing of plants. That is what gets washed into our watershed, whether through irrigation practices like I explained before, or like throughout suburbia, like the more lawns we have, the more fertilizer people will use. And then like what happened last week, we get that first flush of a major rain event, and all those excessive chemicals and nutrients, they just get flash flooded into our watershed basically, and that drives big problems. But what we're seeing in our watershed, at least for the eastern half of Palm Beach County, which is mostly suburban and urban, is those nutrients will drive problems like Enterococcus bacteria, which is something that we sample for every week throughout the Lake Worth Lagoon. Those were off the charts last week because of the rain. But it doesn't necessarily drive cyanobacteria all the time. Yeah.
Dr. Rosen, something to add on that?
Lake Okeechobee has a legacy amount of phosphorus in the bottom of the lake from years and years of agriculture up north. Last I heard, it was 50,000 metric tons of phosphorus in the bottom of the lake. And that's equal to as much of that might come in from runoff. So unless we treat that, there's going to be a continuous source of nutrients for decades coming out of the lake, feeding the blooms in the lake, which again come out onto the East Coast and the West Coast. It's that legacy phosphorus that is something that can be tackled. And we have a program that we've developed. We published on this at the end of December, beginning of January. It's a free online publication talking about that phosphorus. We did a big review of that. So it's something that we're here at the water school at Florida Gulf Coast University in conjunction with an engineering company. We said we think we have a way of taking that out of the equation. It's a huge project. We want to do a pilot, and we're just beginning to shop that around.
Very helpful. I want to squeeze in one more question before we wrap. I know we're pushing up against our hour, and if everybody's watching during their lunch, thank you for sticking with us. This is really informative. Jeff Young asks, why are some areas of Florida affected by red tide while other areas are affected by blue-green algae? Do major blooms of both have the same causes? I think I'll toss it back to you, Dr. Rosen.
So red tide is an organism for the most part that's marine, 24 parts per thousand and greater. It'll move closer to shore and take advantage of nutrients that come down through the canal systems and through our river systems. The blue-green algae, for the most part, are freshwater. So the only time they get to meet is when there's a significant discharge coming out of the lake, as an example. And then the the blue-greens can get recycled and then sort of support the red tide. But the red tide is there long before the blue-greens come downstream and long after. Some of the blooms last 30 months. But it's marine, and it's not a bacteria like the blue-green algae are, but it's a eukaryotic organism, a dinoflagellate. It makes an aerosolized toxin, the brevetoxin, that kills fish itself, and it causes respiratory problems for people on the beach. So they aren't the same, other than they both need nutrients. Red tide's better at taking up nutrients from bacteria, from dead carcasses, and from other organisms. Cyanobacteria are much more likely to just live on inorganic nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus. They love urea, however, and they also need phosphorus and things like that. Some blue-green algae can fix their own atmospheric nitrogen. So if there's not enough in the water, they'll pull it out of the air. Not Microcystis, but the Cylindrospermopsis can. So it's not a simple thing to solve.
Thank you for that. So we are over our hour, but I think it's well justified. All three of you have brought such valuable perspectives to this discussion. It's a discussion that needs to continue in Florida. This problem isn't going away, and we need to keep the pressure on elected officials and other policymakers to address the problems that we talked about today: nutrient pollution, the way we manage Lake Okeechobee. And we didn't get into it so much, but we also need more stormwater treatment areas to treat water, to remove nutrients, which goes hand in hand. So I want to thank all three of you. I also want to thank our supporters at Friends of the Everglades. Your support makes these kinds of conversations possible. And today we actually had an underwriter for this conversation. That was Ameriprise Financial. We want to thank them as well. And I hope that you'll all come back and continue to talk to us about the toxic algae crisis in Florida. We want solutions, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Take care.